Okay, so I'm going to try something slightly different. I only have 8 slides, so it's a bit of a risk. Let's see how it goes. It's basically like a short kind of series of meditations on this topic, like like when we make buildings and places, like what does it tell about us? And it's a very general topic. The kind of like more narrow scope of this lecture series this autumn is educational buildings, and I will definitely talk about them as well, in particular. But I want to kind of like broaden the scope a bit and in a way take a step back and try to kind of give you also something to think about when you're walking around the city in whatever regular situation, and like give some kind of like angles how to see this environment that we have constructed for ourselves. At some point, I guess, if I run out of things to say, then the lecture is over, so it can be a bit shorter. But I want to start by saying that, like, I really want to encourage you to look at all architecture as current architecture. This can be contemporary architecture, very recent. It can be modern architecture. It can be what we would call historical architecture, even very old architecture and very old places. Like, it's, for me personally, it's been very liberating to have this realization that we can look at our environment on this kind of like equal footing. Doesn't matter when the buildings or places have been constructed. If you just see them as part of your current environment, you start to see environment and cities and streets a bit different. Of course, we should note that when the pyramids were constructed, we were biologically exactly identical. Like, so we are very much the same people. But what has changed is culture. And that, of course, is something that we leave a mark of when we are building cities and buildings. You could think that the culture has changed drastically over centuries, even decades, and that's true. But what I think is quite important is we are careful in our judgment of previous times and cultures. Of course, like, just as we are part of this moment, it has some issues, it has some exciting things. It's been the case also previously, and I've become increasingly concerned that we are seemingly quite quick to judge some past times without much consideration from our own lens, and that's of course we do that. That's fine, but I think we should keep in mind that, like, even though the culture has changed a lot to the better, we are not necessarily so much wiser. It's just that the current context where we operate is in so many ways better than it has been in many periods in the past. And like, I'm gonna show some recent architecture and some old architecture, but I'm really interested in trying to think, like, what can these people who have made these places who are not here anymore, most of them are not here anymore, like, what can they teach us? I think it's much better to have this kind of approach that there is something positive that we can get from it, rather than say, like, oh, we are so much better. Let's start with a place in Seinäjoki, in western Finland. this is a place that I have been privileged to be personally involved recently with. So this is a cultural and administrative center designed by Alvar Aalto and built within approximately 30 years. It took even 2 competitions that he won. He won both of them to be able to realize this vision of a city center, and it's truly a remarkable place. I think it's one of the finest places by Aalto, for sure. And what makes it very unique that it's actually this kind of I would say fully realized master plan for an entire city cultural and administrative center. I was recently part of a workshop. The Alvar Aalto Foundation is trying to get several works by Aalto to be included in the UNESCO World Heritage list. And the way they do this is that they take, I think it was 8 different places around Finland designed by Aalto, and you apply for the status of UNESCO World Heritage altogether. So this is like all of them have to be unique and important in this overall constellation of Aalto's work, and somehow representative of not just Aalto's architecture, but they have to speak something deeper about our society. And this Seinäjoki Center is one of these places. And in this workshop, we try to articulate really like what is it that makes this place unique. And it's actually quite interesting when you have to really think about it. It's like maybe somebody is really naturally talented with this, like it has to do with language, and I'm definitely not. And it was quite hard to kind of like pin it down, really. And I also learned about this, the way this process works if you have a UNESCO World Heritage site. First of all, it's a very serious effort. It takes years just to apply. And if you reach this status, it's not guaranteed that you can maintain it. And in this case of Aalto's work in Finland, there is a conscious risk that if any one of these, I think it was 8 sites, will be like severely compromised. Let's say there will be some really radical new residential development right next to some of Aalto's work, and kind of like waters down or removes the qualities of that place entirely or mostly. The organization can decide that actually like this is not kind of representative anymore as it was when it was applied, and they can remove the status from all of Aalto's work. So it's an interesting effort, and it's kind of like there's this collective pressure almost between different cities and towns to make sure that if this status will be granted, that it will also be the case in the future. When you think like what makes this Seinäjoki Center so special, first thing you could maybe notice is that there are essentially not necessarily all, but most of the institutions of the society at that time represented here. You have the church and a community center. The first part of this composition that was realized with the landmark tower. And then you have a city hall, a library, a city theater, and an administrative office building. So you kind of like bring the public life of the town to this one spot. And what makes this a bit special in Aalto's work is that it has this clearly defined, articulated outdoor space that is almost like the center of the composition. He used, of course, lots of landmark or landscape elements in his designs. One of them you can see right there by the main building and the sloping landscape towards the auditorium. It has this kind of axial composition from the church past all these buildings and ending here to the administrative office building. So what is really fascinating here is that these institutions are presented here quite on an equal footing. So not one is above other, really, but they still all have their distinct character. And it's quite an achievement to be able to do this in such balanced way. Here you see a view from the city hall towards the church tower. Another thing that makes this interesting in Aldo's work is that this is one of the, not sure if it's the only, but one of the few examples where he got to design both a religious and a profane building in the same composition. So this also represents this sort of like state and church kind of union that was, of course, maybe more important at that time than it is in our time. What's also fascinating is that he was able to kind of talk about and visualize some hierarchies in society, because after all, there are, no matter what we want to think about the society, there are always hierarchies. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it is, but not necessarily. And I think like it's quite natural to have different hierarchies and structures in society. And he visualized them here in quite subtle ways, of course, by creating accents, but also with some smaller things, like there were different kinds of doors you could enter these different buildings, depending on like what was your position in society and what was your role in this whole thing. Also, this place is an example of like Aldo's kind of counter statement to this sort of abstract, immaterial, international modernism. So very much the sensory place with, you can I mean in every building by Aldo, of course, like you have the same qualities here in the technical university campus, as well as basically everywhere. So this was something that we also defined in this UNESCO workshop as kind of unique quality of Aldo's architecture. Of course, that applies to the whole set of buildings and places that were part of this effort. Maybe so basically, like what we do as architects, if you get to design something like this place, but it can be also much less, let's say, significant on a surface level. Like we kind of like we get to present our view of the world and I really want to stress that this is not like a very, it's not so simple. It's not very direct often. And just to highlight this point, I have a quote here from a lieutenant general of the US Army who recently said in an interview that to be true to its purpose, the military cannot be a mirror image of the society it serves. And I think this is an interesting point. If you think like you can have a democratic society that arguably has improved lives of countless people, but as part of that, you kind of like you have to accept some realities about the world, and you recognize that you might need an army, and in order for an army to be effective, it cannot operate on the same basis as the rest of society. And I think this is interesting. this is an image that I have in almost every opportunity where I get to talk about architecture. And what you see here is a city block in the center of Helsinki. Originally built in the very late 19th century, and then extended or actually modified about 100 years later. And both the original city block and then this intervention from the 90s were done by what were considered like good architects, well-recognized architects. The Museum of Finnish Architecture, by the way, is right on the other side of the street. And there used to be a police station here, or the headquarters. It was demolished, and now I guess there's already a new building in there. You see kind of like the ghost of the old police station there. But what you really like, what becomes very clear when you look at this picture, that it is a very cubic, very big building volume. This is basically what buildings are. They are built for a purpose. There's a need for this space, and we as architects have to serve those purposes, obviously. And you see that like much of in this, of course, like now we're talking about a very regulated volume. So there probably wasn't much room to decide like how high you would want to build it or how low. So like many things were set in this particular case. But what you see is that you create architecture on this very thin layer of this volume. So this in the 1889, you had all this volume, and you created this layer of maybe even less than a meter. And this is where you get to like present your aesthetics and your style, basically like your image of how you want cities to look like. And here you have another interpretation applied on the exact same volume. You even see the roof shape is identical. So that's quite interesting. It's really like we operate sometimes on a very thin layer, and it makes all the difference. You can clearly tell, like, I mean, these are two different, very different architectures there. What has happened? I mean, there could be opinions that this is better, but I would challenge that. I think that is better. And you see how like sensitive these things are. Here you can play with something like 1 meter. And here you play something like 20 to 30 centimeters or 10 even. And that is because this is an insulated wall, this layer wall structure, and this is a solid brick wall. So when you work with something that is homogeneous, one layer, it's quite natural to make this all these profiles, they are just the extrusion of the same material. Whereas here, when you construct this facade, if you want to create any kind of three-dimensional effect, which I think people really find quite important. I mean, this is not a flat facade. And the reason why people are quite drawn to old buildings is that they do have this sort of like sense of depth. It's missing here entirely. And well, there can be many reasons, but one is definitely that if you have a layer of something like 10 centimeters, and behind this you have a soft insulation layer, every little profile you want to create here is like an additional effort. It's almost like an illusion you create. There's nothing wrong with creating illusions. We do that in architecture a lot, so that's fine. But it doesn't come naturally in this architecture. So now we can see that even if like basically you're working with the same cubic volume, and the volume is always more or less the same, it really matters if you can work with 10 to 20 centimeters, or let's say 80 to 100 centimeters. Makes a huge difference in the end. I would also use this image to argue that in my opinion, much of urban planning and urban design, especially urban design, happens on the facade. I think we pay maybe too little attention on actually like designing a facade, designing a nice facade. And I don't know how much this is talked about in the like urban design studies, but I would guess not too much. And maybe that highlights an issue with dividing the, let's call them chairs or topics in this university by subject. In many schools, you have professorships that are personal, so whoever is the professor gets to choose more or less. Are they going to this time look at facades and next time urban space? And I think this would be much more flexible and kind of like would give a better picture of architecture as something like that is a whole and not like cannot be divided into these topics like now we are here in the building design chair topic. Maybe also with this image you can think about building costs. This certainly was more expensive building to do. But and of course, like as practicing architects, this is what we spend most of our time even with. Like we are struggling with schedules and struggling with budgets, and it's never enough. I mean, you always have to make compromises. It's part of the design process, of course. But if you let a little bit of time to pass, these issues like what did this cost? Is nobody even knows. It doesn't matter. I think this is something to maybe keep in mind that like when you're working on when you get a chance to realize a building or a place, even if it feels at that moment like okay, like I'm so like drowned in this like all this conflicting interests that in the end like it matters what you do and try to do it as well as you can, and that's really the only thing that will matter in the long run. Like don't go to present your project and say like this looks like this because we had to cut the budget. It's irrelevant. It's not interesting, even if you had to do that. And I understand most of us like really have to work in that way. Okay, maybe like a central topic in this talk is this question of architecture as language. Some of you have maybe heard already some of what I'm going to say here, but maybe it's worth repeating. You could argue that like when we work as architects, we speak a certain language of architecture, and this is really a wonderful thing. It makes it so that we can understand each other. It's quite problematic if you invent your own language entirely. There has been, I guess, always architects, increasingly maybe nowadays, who either wish to do this or at least like present themselves as something of a genius, which can be true, but someone who have created their own expression, their own language. But the problem with that really is that if you speak your own language, like other people cannot understand you, you're quite lonely. I think it's a bit sad. I mean, you're lonely when you speak and other people cannot really understand you necessarily. So I think it's wonderful that we have these alphabets, and then we can make words and then sentences and then eventually write with this language. And this was really like a seminal moment for myself. I lived in Berlin at the time in 2007, and I found a lecture online by Swiss architect Peter Nagli, who talked about this very topic. And this comparison is from his lecture in London. And he really raised powerfully this issue of language in architecture, and he has done so also after. You can find interviews from magazines where he talks about this very topic. So if you do that after this presentation, like you'll recognize where I'm getting many of these ideas. So Markley used this example This is Parthenon here, from the 5th century before the Common Era. And this is San Pietro Church in Italy from the 11th century. So there is something like 1,500 years between these two places when they were built. They are in the same scale, by the way. And what you can clearly see that it's they are based on the same language, but they are like different interpretations of this language. You find columns, and then you find walls, and then you find steps. But they are organized differently based on what kind of like image these different cultures wanted to create of themselves. This is a polytheistic religion, and this is monotheistic, and so on. So if you first look at the Parthenon, the columns are on the outside, and then you have the wall. Well, you do have columns inside, of course, also. But here you have the wall outside and the columns inside. You have these steps in both of these buildings. And here's a fragment of Parthenon, and here's the San Pietro Church. So you see that like you can create quite different images of impressions with this using the very same alphabet of the architectural language. There is really so much refinement in this ancient Greek architecture that it's almost impossible for us to even like comprehend the kind of mindset that people had when they were making these places. The last time when I was contemplating this, I read a Finnish book called Rakennustaide-luomana. Highly recommended for the Finnish speakers. You can find it from a second-hand shop quite easily, I guess. It's a wonderful. These pages are from that book. It's really wonderful book on. It's very philosophical. The layout is great. It's very radical. It looks totally contemporary if you just look at it like aesthetically. It's a wonderful little book. But it pretty much talked about the same issue. How every culture kind of creates their own image and leaves it for the future generations. So in this ancient Greek architecture, the column, as you know, is slightly. It's not a straight line. It's slightly curved. Here in Macauley's lecture, there's this small image of the Parthenon of this plinth, and even that is slightly curved. It is not straight, and it's just unbelievable. Imagine now I'm taking this view, like let's try to judge this architecture in contemporary terms to see like what happens. Like imagine you're in a design meeting with a bunch of engineers around the table, and you discuss this topic of making this plinth slightly curved for visual effect. And that just highlights how far we are from this thinking. But it doesn't make this unreal. It happened, it was constructed, there was a general agreement to make it exactly like that, and it was realized, and it's just quite wonderful. And I think like it's often the case when you look at some older architecture that like you really there's just this sense of wonder, like there was something in the mindset of these people that art is just so distant that it feels hard to create this sort of emotional connection to it anymore. You can just be happy that we have these fragments. Something I also want to point out here is like Michael did in this lecture that I mentioned, is that these really are not stairs. You should see them as this sort of like platforms that are stacked on top of each other. They happen to form steps, yes, but like what really is going on here is that you have these consecutive platforms here. And it's a simple thing to say, but like try to think of when you leave this room now and you look at your environment, like try to think about things like this a bit more. Like, what do you really see? Like, what is it conceptually that you see? There are some other examples of languages, obviously music, coding. So like we have come up with lots of languages and they serve some certain purposes. And architecture is one of them. Few more examples about this topic of building costs, like this place here, St. Peter Square in Vatican it almost bankrupt the Vatican when they made this. It was so expensive, but now again, like we don't even think about it. And in this book, Gustav Strengel, who wrote the Rakennustaideluomana, is like meditating between these columns. Like he says that these columns are as wide from the bottom as they are from the top, whereas these columns are slightly more narrow here on the top than from the bottom, although they both make the bulge. And well, if you are a Finnish speaker, maybe you have even read some of this now while listening, but it is wonderful critique of architecture here. The language is just fascinating, and of course the thinking behind it. Now these are some school buildings, and this is made by Peter Mackley, who I was referring to in the last slide. So this is his contribution, 2004. So it's not exactly recent, but anyway presents our generation. And this image I took last week when I was thinking about this lecture from the Helsinki city center, very close to the main church. Maybe first it's worth, like before we go to like talk about the architecture here, what's going on. It's like to think about a bit like what is now when we talk about educational building, like what is learning and what is teaching. Learning, of course, happens all the time. Like we learn through our senses and seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling, smelling things. So there's like a continuous input, and then like our brains turn it into some sort of useful information so that we can operate in this world. But teaching is a bit different. It is like it's like a conscious effort. And what really happens when you teach someone, like basically now I'm not necessarily trying to teach, but I'm trying to like communicate some of these ideas. Like there is some kind of abstract concept in my brain, literally like in the nervous connections in my brain, that is unique. Like all of your brains are unique. And now I'm trying to like make those similar connections in your brains. And it's very physical when you think about it like that, but I guess it comes down to that in the end. And I'm using like this air in the room as a medium and the light here as a medium. Your brain receives this information, and then there will be like new connections in your brain. So all teaching basically is like transmitting these abstract concepts and then like configuring your brain. And this is where we do it. So when you get to this topic of like how should a school building look like? I don't think it's not quite that obvious, like a school should look a certain way. Just the effort of like teaching and learning is already like so diverse and so abstract that it's not so easy to say like, okay, like now I'm making a school building, it should look a certain way, and now I'm making, let's say, an office building, it should look a certain way. They indeed do look certain ways, and there are subtle differences. But I think what really matters is that we make good buildings, decent buildings. Like these, both of them are built for educational purposes. This is built for children and teenagers. This is built for adults in a university. But it comes down to basically some topics like when you want to create just a decent environment, regardless if you're making a school building or not, there's this question of aesthetics. Now, if you keep in mind the previous images that I showed, like talking about language, even though there is like a big time difference, this is something like, roughly speaking, 200 years old. This is, by the way, only 85 years old, so not that old. And this is approximately 20 years old. But I think they are relatable. Or like, what I mean is that there are definitely a lot in common between them, and that's because they use this architectural language and quite elemental language. This is maybe something that I would encourage you to think about when you are designing buildings, that if you manage to keep your language quite elemental and simple in a way, it reaches a wider audience. It resonates typically better. And as you learn these basic alphabets, then gradually, when your skills grow and accumulate, then you can start using it in more creative ways, in more individual ways. And some of us get to, not talking about myself, but like some in this society gets to assume this role of like a signature architect who like really tries to manifest our culture in very unique ways. But there is nothing wrong with working about these basic elements. It's actually a really good approach. I really encourage that. The language is roughly speaking the same. There's this question of like, when you make buildings aesthetics, then technology and culture, you kind of like need all of them. I was already talking about the technology aspect. These are solid wall buildings, and this is not. So you work with a slightly different, your means are slightly different. You have certain aesthetics, but then quite importantly, you need to have this culture where you say like, no, I'm going to make this building nice. And that takes a lot of effort, and it takes also a certain level of whatever is the opposite of selfishness. Like you have to commit yourself to the people around you and to the society around you. You can find, unfortunately, many examples of this in Helsinki and in other cities where people have assumed this opposite position, that I'm going to think about myself first. What can I extract from this urban environment? What can I get? And I want to get the max. I want to get everything I can, and I want to give as little as possible. And this is like a cultural issue. It's hard to go to tell someone like, hey, you should pay more attention to this. It's not nice what you're doing. But it really has to start from like how we raise children, how, like, what kind of institutions we have to guide us. But this is absolutely essential. We have to go back to the kind of way of doing things where we pay more attention to basically like just see ourselves as part of a society, and always in the way that like no matter how good we think we are, like it's we are smaller than the society around us, and like there may be some tendencies or trends that tell you to think exactly the opposite, like myself first, what can I get from this, like what's in it for me, and that won't work. So that's something to keep in mind. This pink building, it didn't used to be pink. It was basically restored to this color. It was yellow just some, I guess even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's designed by Jan Wijk. So the Helsinki University main building, which you see an extension of here, in the yellow color, the original main building is designed by Carl Ludwig Engel, who made much of the score around the big white church in Helsinki city center. And then there's an architect, Jan Wijk, who continued his work and became like basically the architect for the Helsinki University, and he got to design this building. The Finnish National Library is in this same city block, but on the other side. Nowadays, this belongs to the library, but it used to be the chemistry department. And it's quite interesting. I read about this building that when it was finished, people were actually quite critical about it. They didn't like the style. They thought that this facade is clumsy. So this was considered clumsy. And it's another reminder how far we are from, I mean, maybe not all of you, but I certainly like, I don't know the language well enough to make this remark of this being clumsy. To me, it's really not. It's quite good, but yeah, I guess it would be really beneficial to spend more time. I didn't do that when I was studying to study the history of architecture. I was really involved myself with working on architecture competitions, working in practice, and to an extent that was maybe a good choice for me. I was rather successful in what I was trying to do, but it's really like I'm trying to catch up basically with the basic knowledge of architecture. And then this yellow building that you see here is, like I said, it's an extension to the Helsinki University main building, which is on the other side of the city block. This is built 100 years later, this part here. And there was a design competition for it in early 20th century, and there was a big question like, how do you extend this main building? Do you follow the style? Do you take it more or less as it is and basically repeat it, or do you make your own interpretation? This is built after the Paimio Sanitarium was built, by the way. So kind of gives context here. And then there was the decision like, let's make it to totally blend in. There are some differences, obviously, like the entrance, which you don't see in this picture. It's along this road, though. It clearly has like the style of the early 20th century, and there are like subtle differences, and they all work quite surprisingly well with this baseline of much older architectural style. So that kind of like so it's again like it's a subtle question, like how do we extend something that is already there? And when I was studying, I was told in every single occasion that you have to make a contrast. This was like the given truth, but I'm not sure about that anymore. I do totally get it. Like sometimes the contrast is the right way to go, but as some time passes, then it becomes like gradually less and less relevant. If there would be another 200 years, which eventually there will, then like it feels okay. What's the big deal? 19th century, 20th century. It's a long time ago. Now we are still quite close. It's really 85 years ago or so when this was constructed. Okay. So talking about school buildings, this question like how much should we reflect the values of our culture? Like we were just talking about aesthetics and the language of architecture, but how about the values? Can they even be reflected in architecture? So Kaisaniemi Primary School, again in the city center. I took this photo last week. I think it's really a radical building. I love the volume, the proportions, everything is really radical. Like if you would make this floor plan now, it would be considered as like really interesting and conceptual and nice, and that's what it is. But as you see, it's an extremely linear building. And now when we are making school buildings, this is something that we discussed in this earlier in this lecture series, like we don't necessarily consider our society so linear anymore. We want to emphasize kind of like network qualities and a less hierarchical structure and so on. But this school is, I think, the second oldest school still in use in Helsinki, and like it works perfectly fine. It's a good building in this current environment, just as it was when it was built. That's then you can think like how should we like it's again, it's not that obvious. Like if we want to see our society and culture as kind of like non-linear, non-hierarchical, very flat in a certain way, like a building can still have a corridor. It can be like a very simple building. It's the connection is really not obvious at all. But you can just rather think like how in this case, like how should you build for children? And I was thinking about this building. Like I said, it's very conceptual. That's really great for the kids. It's good to make conceptual buildings. Kids are very, very conceptual. It has a great spatial concept here. 2 stairs and this big hallway and classrooms, plenty of natural light, very comfortable facades, very friendly. Like I said, good proportions. It looks quite different on this side. So this picture only tells a part of the truth here. But these are all like great qualities when you're building for children. So I just want to emphasize, like when you make something for children, don't make it too simple. I'm gonna have another set of slides just talking about that very topic here. But rather like the same principles can be used more or less if you're designing something for children or for, let's say, the teachers. You have to design it for the teachers as well. You also like, maybe most importantly, you have to decide it for everybody who like uses this part of the city. It becomes part of their everyday life. So that's something to keep in mind. I know that I'm kind of like going back to these same points over and over again, but if there is a takeaway from this lecture, like it could be that like just make decent buildings. That's really like what I want you to do when you graduate here and you go in the practice and start building this society. Maybe one more remark about this building. Absolutely nothing would prevent us from building like this anymore. The wall structure, you can have a debate about the aesthetics, like should we go back to how we were building before? I'm not like a big fan of that necessarily, but like it's again like it's quite a subtle topic. We would definitely have the resources if we would decide to use them for building like this. So absolutely nothing would prevent us building like this, but we don't. It's kind of tragic. So I think it could be universally recognized that what we have here has so much character and quality that it is really the places where we can do something comparable nowadays. They're quite, it happens and it's fantastic, but it should happen much more frequently. These, what we now consider as our like architectural heritage, many of these buildings were built for a practical need. It wasn't like, now this is like something absolutely special and unique we're doing here. It was a school. Just had to make a school. This is now what I just want to have this one set of images here to address this point one more time. Like how do we design for children? How to do it? And like generally speaking, like I'm hoping us to be like a bit more ambitious. There has been some really interesting times in recent history when there was a lot of emphasis, a lot of focus on daycares. In the late 19th century, was Friedrich Froebel really created quite this like radical new approach to teach children. He coined this word kindergarten, and then it was adopted in the English language. Here is an unidentified kindergarten in Los Angeles, and this is from a book that he published, or he didn't publish, but he like influenced this this book. So these are called verbal gifts, and they are like a set of toys. These are meant for, I think, 2 to 3 year old, so quite small children. And the idea of Rebel's way of raising children was that you have to like take care of this sort of natural instinct that children have, like that is it had a lot to do with logic, with even mathematics, geometry, and kind of like nurture that and let it grow in children. And big part of this idea was that you have some like basic elements that are quite elemental and simple, and then you can create endless variations of them, and you can like rebuild things and build them again. And I think gardening was an important part of this way of this kindergarten idea. Just thinking about like how do we give like an image to a society? How do we give form and shape to our culture? Le Corbusier went to this kindergarten, or this type of kindergarten. Frank Lloyd Wright is so too. I think Frank Lloyd Wright's mother was actually a teacher in a kindergarten. Buckminster Fuller attended a similar kindergarten. And if you look at some verbal gifts that are meant for all the children, like you can find some really quite striking resemblances from their like aesthetics to a facade by Le Corbusier, or a composition or floor plan by Frank Lloyd Wright. So it's really like it's quite the connection is definitely quite clear. This is a playground that Le Corbusier designed on top of the Unité building in Marseille. This here on the corner, this image is a proposal for a playground in New York by Isamu Noguchi. And that just made me think like somehow like the topic of this or the it was a competition. You had to design a playground that is completely safe. So like you really like almost cannot hurt yourself there, and that was his proposal. I'm not sure if he won, but like this was not realized. But just looking at the artistic ambition here and thinking about like, okay, basically your task was to make a safe playground. Like I think we should just be a bit more ambitious in terms of like when we are making places for children, for example, that it also has to present our culture like and us as creative people, as adults. Here is a Japanese daycare center that I think like really kind of like captures some of these ideas. This is a facade of it, and there is a side plan or a floor plan. There was a more recent development in like designing daycares, or basically like not just designing the buildings, but like how like basically like an educational approach. How do you treat children? That formed in the post-World War II Italy, so-called Reggio Emilia approach. And there has been many others, but it had very similar kind of tendencies. This poem is like a central kind of manifestation of these ideas. Like you should really like that. Basically, like children have all it takes. Like we shouldn't like prevent them to expressing themselves quite freely. Painting, sculpting, drama was important in this Reggio Emilia approach, and having had my own children in the Finnish daycare, and of course, like being a Finn myself and having gone through the entire Finnish education, I see a lot of similarities in this Reggio Emilia approach in the Finnish daycares. I think that especially the daycare, this is something to really be proud of as a Finn. It's something that we have figured out quite well. When I was designing a daycare myself in Germany, I was doing some research and came across of a daycare center in Manhattan, a private daycare, like is the case often there, and it cost what is to like a Scandinavian like outrageous much money to have your children there, like thousands per child per month. And they were advertising it as something like totally cutting edge, radical. And when I read the description, I was thinking, this is my children's daycare here in Helsinki. Really like one-to-one. So this is something we have really figured out here quite well. Okay, we are coming close to the finish line here. Can we export culture? Or how do we operate like in between cultures? This is a women's center in Senegal designed by Jenny Reuter, Helena Sandman, and Saya Holman. Many of you have met maybe all of them. A fantastic project, really. Not just in terms of like the setting and the context, but I think also in terms of form and all these like very specific things that are going on with the openings and steps and everything. I think this is really quite a fantastic project. Now here is a picture of a Rolex learning center in Switzerland designed by Japanese architects, Sana. For some reason, this is not as often talked about in this like through this lens of like cultural exchange, although it's just as, I mean, of course, just as much something like that. I think when you do this, when you go as an architect and work in an entirely different kind of culture, you take in a way like it's a fine line you have to walk, obviously. Like you wanna bring something from your own background that can be positive, but I mean, simultaneously you have to understand that you work in a context that you probably cannot fully understand, and so on. So that's really a fine line to walk. These are like interesting examples of this. I think you can find a lot of also really weird examples of this sort of like cultural exchange. Maybe it's not so like much a thing right now, but when I graduated and started working in an architecture practice, like lots of officers had huge interest in working in China, and there would be like one project after another where you would go as, let's say, like Western architect or something else like a Japanese architect, and you would do like a landmark building. And of course, the scale was enormous, and like there was so much like banality going on, you cannot even like believe it. So like there can be very like there can be fine examples of this kind of like cultural export, but then also it's a very kind of complicated topic. Again, I've been thinking about it sometimes when opening AutoCAD in my computer. There is this called splash screen. It's this little screen that comes up when you open a software while you wait for it to load. And it used to have a picture of a building, and always when you have this like arbitrary like new edition by every year. You had like you had to update your software, and you would get a new picture. Like I was thinking, like, what is this I'm looking at? I mean, like every time when I go to work and I start working, and do I have to look at this? I found a way to disable it. That's another example of like, let's call it like international architecture. I don't know how it looks nowadays. I don't use AutoCAD anymore. But in the 2000s, they were just like horrific. And I was thinking at some point I should have a contest in my office, like who can make a worse building than that? I mean, it takes effort. You have to like, can you do that? And that's it's interesting because this is a software that is much used by also good architects. And like, how is it that they have these kind of images there? I don't know. It's weird. I have to address very quickly something about values in education. When I started as a lecturer in Aalto 3 years ago, I did a lot of pedagogical training. Did the entire program in 1 year, which is really a lot. And we had interesting discussions there with my peers who were also working at Aalto University. And I remember there was this one time when this topic of like values of our society came up. And there was a serious kind of like idea floated around, like, should our education be value-free in order not to offend someone who comes from a different context? I thought this is like impossible. How can our education be value-free? Obviously, it's to me it's obvious it's impossible. But I think this is like a unique question nowadays in something like we would call like West or Western culture. Like we somehow like have to shy away from our own heritage. I think it's weird. I don't really like. Well, I do actually understand a bit where it's coming from. Maybe like some postmodern philosophy from the 70s and the traumas of the last century, the big wars and everything. It's a complicated history, but it's a weird and surprising development, seemingly quite unstoppable. Really, I think what we should really like aim for is like diversity of ideas. I mean, what happened to this Martin Luther King's famous statement? You should judge people by the content of the character. It's not fashionable maybe nowadays. I don't know why. That's so universal and so self-evident. Anyway, maybe that is another example of like really like a manifestation of openness in when you're designing an educational building. Like this is like kind of like the most radical example I can think of it. I'm happy that it was realized. It's a fantastic piece of engineering and architecture, really quite astounding. But I believe it's actually quite hard to use, to be honest. It's also like it just feels like this question of like open learning spaces. We have talked a lot about it in this lecture series already, but to me it just feels like something that it's like this children's puzzle that you have like a rectangular piece and a circular opening, and you just try to hammer this piece in and you say like this must fit. We must make open spaces. Although like what I've heard like from my own experience and talking to others, like parents don't like them really, children don't like them, teachers don't like them, but we still make them. It's a bit strange. Maybe with this openness, like we have an example here in this building. When I studied here 20 years ago, we had the original furniture still in the studio rooms, and they were like fixed furniture, and you would get your own spot when you started a year. You had your drawers, you could set up your ruler. Not being nostalgic, it's just that there was a sense of like belonging to this place because it was fixed. And nowadays, if you go, this is not a criticism towards Vara itself, it's a criticism towards like the way we make educational spaces nowadays. Everything is like slightly flimsy and you can just move it around, and the tables are always like slightly like not quite like aligned. You have like all kinds of like electric cords going all over the place, and like nothing is like permanent, and it just makes it so that like when you go to these spaces you also feel kind of like lose, like, okay, should I just go, like, where can I be, like, I think we should be more daring in just making actual places, and I think this challenges the current view entirely in how we make educational spaces. Okay, last slide. I try to be brief with this, although this is kind of like a conclusion. It's like my thesis, basically. I'm testing this now for the first time. It's something that I've been thinking over the recent 1 or 2 years. And I think I eventually want to kind of like articulate it quite precisely, because I think there is something to it. But well, before we go to the conclusion, let me just say a word about the medieval mindset. Again, like, it is really quite difficult to comprehend how these places were built over centuries. Like, what is this mindset that makes you so that you start a project and you know that you're not going to be there necessarily even before the foundation is laid? And I think even more interestingly, you can think like, how is it, like, what there is in this mindset and this culture that makes it so that you're born and this thing is under construction, and then you become an adult and you like become an active part of the society and you go build it. It's been already started. You just go to continue it, and you die and you didn't even make it to the roofline. And you have generation after generation doing the same thing until eventually it's finished. And it's made without drawings, really. And it's made without a chief architect. And these are like the most magnificent pieces of architecture we have in Europe. There is really something to it. I think this, like when I read this book by Irene Skalberg last Christmas, I really kind of like I was really inspired about this. Like, well, the architecture itself, yes, but also this mindset, and you realize that I'm quite happy personally. Like, I don't live in those times, but I think there is something really unique and really quite fascinating. Like, just when you think about the aesthetics here, it feels quite alien already, and this sort of like aesthetics of repetition and so on. It's just like it's quite foreign, but really quite fascinating and really consistent. So there is definitely something to be learned from it. But what I want to conclude with is kind of like a positive vision. I think like things can get really good. And this has to do with like conversions of 3 different basically technologies. So the first one is like, I think it's a matter of economical incentives. Like, I personally believe we will have abundant clean energy in the future. And that makes the current paradigm of like, how do you make buildings completely obsolete? Like, it's fine if things leak, for example, in terms of like air flows. And I think this happens probably a bit sooner than maybe we would expect. So if there is there's abundant energy basically that is quite cheap and that is clean, like we will wonder like how on earth we made buildings like vacuum bags. It's kind of like when you make a building like that, it's like you can create a balance where things are just fine, but it's like a balance if you have a ball on top of a hill. It's like unstable. Once you like turn off the electricity for 2 years, the building is moldy. The ball rolls off the hill. But if you make buildings like very resilient and like fault tolerant, it's like another kind of balance where you have a ball at the bottom of the hill. Like you can knock it and you can do things, but it will kind of return there. And I want to return to that kind of architecture. We have lots of examples. It works. We should build like that again. Another of the 3 technologies is labor. Obviously, when we look at this, we think like, no, this would never work. Nowadays, society is different. Like, it's good that this is not possible anymore because it took untold effort by so many people to do this who maybe didn't do it willingly. But I think we are quite close to getting this automated. There will be autonomous robots doing this. And then how is that? I mean, this can run 24/7 all the time. Suddenly, like we have a totally new set of tools as architects that we can do. The construction will move back to the construction site from factories, and it's just a matter of your imagination what you can do. It's labor-wise, it's possible. It's going to be possible. That's going to transform our society, I guess, in much bigger ways also. But in architecture, this will be like maybe a huge shift. And the last technology that is needed is what could be called sound money. This is hard money. This is not like when you see this once, you cannot unsee it. Like we live in a society and culture since about 100 years ago, where we take more and more debt, we print more and more money. We see the consequences of that right now quite clearly. And this incentivizes spending and taking loan, kind of like borrowing from the future for your own gain, let's say political gain or some other gain. You borrow from the future. But really with the emergence of Bitcoin, this can change. This is the first technology where the supply of your money is limited forever. Nobody can print more money. That takes us much closer to where we used to be with gold, although it's better because it's actually limited. So that's going to incentivize completely different behavior. It's going to intensify saving instead of spending, and it's most importantly going to incentivize like long-term thinking. You hopefully start to think long-term again, like these people, but in a completely, new kind of society. I don't want to go back to this. We can have like a new renaissance that looks very different, but have some of the similarities that made this possible. So thanks.